It's interesting that a writer who had a very strong influence on Tolstoy, a French writer by the name of Stendhal, as you probably know, that's a pseudonym. His real name was Henri Weil. Stendhal, when he wrote a rather famous autobiography called La vie de Henri Brûlard, that is to say, the life of Henry the Burning. Brûlard is burning in French. Stendhal obviously wrote this in the 1840s, since he died. He obviously couldn't write it after 1848 when he died. It's curious that Stendhal expresses almost exactly the same thing. That at the death of his mother, he was unable to cry, and of course when he was unable to cry, people around him thought that he was a terrible youngster, and so on and so on. Now what I find especially interesting about this is that Stendhal's autobiography, La vie d'Henri Brûlard, was not published until the 1880s. That is to say, 40 years after the death of the writer. Tolstoy wrote his autobiography, of course, in what he called his autobiography, in the 1850s, so there's absolutely no chance that Tolstoy could have read this in Stendhal. In short, Tolstoy did absolutely in a parallel way what Stendhal did, in no way knowing that Stendhal did this. This seems to me to indicate that in the temperament of the two men, there was something very, very parallel that had nothing to do with direct influence. And of course, this is all the more interesting when you realize that in many ways they were opposite characters. Stendhal was a worshipper of Napoleon. Tolstoy had great contempt for Napoleon. Stendhal was very much interested in comme il faut. Tolstoy hated comme il faut. To be sure, Stendhal was very much interested in the Russians, but of course he knew nothing about Tolstoy. That is, in spite of the fact that in many ways they were opposites, nevertheless there was something in their temperament that was very, very parallel, and there's something both paradoxical and it seems to me explanatory in the way that the influence went, although it was not direct influence, it was parallelism. Tolstoy, of course, was very much interested in education, how you brought up young people, how somehow young people were formed to become the adults they became. And Saint-Jérôme worked very, very hard to get him properly prepared for the university. In those days, of course, the aristocrats were trained by their tutors and not by public schools in how to get into the university. So they had to bone up very, very careful on the entrance exam. By listening to Saint-Jérôme, Nikolenko was able to enter, to pass the entrance examinations, to get into the University of Kazan, while at the very same time he was totally rejecting everything that Saint-Jérôme did because he considered him a person of terrible vanity. In any case, the young fellow comes into the university very proud of his abilities, proud of the fact that he could look into the human heart and so on, and then he came to the Latin examination. He saw that the young fellow next to him was very much worried about the Latin examination. Well, he himself had no worries. He knew Latin very, very well. He could handle anything that was tossed at him. And so he began to tutor the young fellow, how he should react to the Latin examination when he got it. And the professor noticed that he was condescending to this young man next to him. As a matter of fact, he even tried secretly to try to coach him. The professor said, "Never mind. Wait till it's your turn. We'll see how well you know Latin." Well, of course, the young man that Nikolenko tried to help got through, and Nikolenko's vanity receives its comeuppance when the professor presents him a passage from the Latin poet Horace that he says, not only could I not translate, but nobody could have translated this piece. It was so difficult and so complicated that no human being could possibly translate this. Well, I think anybody who's ever taken a Latin exam, or for that matter, anybody who's ever taken an examination, knows very well how that feels. So that his vanity got its comeuppance in a very, very effective way. There's a famous quote from this novel that, of course, is very, very touching in relation to Tolstoy. He says, «Счастливая, счастливая, невозвратимая пора детства. Как не любить, как не лелеять воспоминания о ней. Воспоминания эти освежают, возвышают мою душу». Oh, happy, deeply happy, irretrievable time of childhood. How was it possible not to love, not to cuddle, not to bring to one's bosom its memories? These memories refresh me and they raise up my soul. There's something in the essence of childhood, the naivete, the innocence, the deep belief in what one does, that is deeply moving to the mature Tolstoy. And as Tolstoy goes about the writing of his novels, clearly he tries very, very hard to get back to those deeply moving, those deeply direct sentiments that one has as a child. The quality of childishness is very, very important toward understanding the psychology and the characters of the mature Tolstoy. And here you have the statement in this beautiful early sense of Tolstoy stating this. Turning to a different work, Tales of Sevastopol was an outgrowth of what Tolstoy saw and experienced when in 1854-55 Russia got involved in a disastrous war, the so-called Crimean War. Tolstoy was a second lieutenant and saw action in the war. As a matter of fact, the results in the Crimea were so bad for the Russians that Nicholas I himself, remember our old friend who gave Pushkin such a hard time and exiled and almost executed Dostoevsky, in a certain sense got his own comeuppance, because that army to which he had given so much attention, so many resources, and so much love was defeated by the combined forces of the British, the French, and the Turks down in the Crimea. Turkey wanted to rule certain territories of that place, and the Russians had made demands on them, which the British and French did not want to see happen, because they were very much worried about the balance of power in Europe. They were worried that the Russians would become too powerful, and it would be impossible to maintain the balance of power in Europe, so they allied themselves with the Turks and tried to help them against the Russians. The result was a hideously bloody war, at least hideously bloody by 19th century standards, where there was a siege in the city of Sevastopol, which is down on the peninsula that juts out into the Black Sea in the southern part of Russia. The Russian troops defended the city absolutely heroically, but in spite of all their heroism, the British, French, and Turkish allies inexorably moved in on them, and furthermore, the supplies for the Russian army and the strategies of the Russian generals were very badly handled. The strategy and the supplies on the British, French, and Turkish side were much more sophisticated, so that gradually they managed to grind the Russians down and push them back towards Sevastopol. In the beginning, Tolstoy had great enthusiasm for what he considered to be the heroism and the national destiny of Russia. And he believed that the government was engaged in a campaign that was tremendously important for Russia. He went all out as an enthusiastic Russian patriot. Then his eyes began to open up. He began to realize that, as a matter of fact, what this was really exposing was the backwardness, the corruption, the bad organization of this empire, which on the surface had been so rigorously and well organized by Nicholas I. And so then he began to turn critical. Obviously, the Russian government was not very happy about the criticism that he aimed at the war movement. They saw him as someone who was on the other side, someone who was making them feel ashamed of themselves, and so they saw to it that he got no advancement in the army. And Tolstoy later on said, well, I wanted to become a general in the army, and that was closed off to me, so instead, he said, I became a general in literature. Tolstoy, the general in the field of literature, the general in the army of writers. This is something that he talks about later on in his life. Of course, what Tolstoy was very much interested in was the nature of true courage and steadfastness as opposed to the phony kind often touted in military rhetoric. The work shows how his mind is thinking about the realities of wartime and the famous military valor of the Russian army. One can easily see how he put this together with the accounts that he had read in Stendhal's novel, The Charterhouse of Parma, where the protagonist of Stendhal, a man named Fabrizio del Dongo, who worships Napoleon. Now, you understand Tolstoy did not worship Napoleon, and yet this protagonist of Stendhal worships Napoleon and moves heaven and earth in order to go and fight with Napoleon's forces, although, as a matter of fact, his family is very much against Napoleon, very much against what Napoleon is doing and bringing revolutionary ideas not only to France, but also to northern Italy, where the family lived. And so Fabrizio gets himself involved in the army of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. And suddenly, we see the Battle of Waterloo through the eyes of a drunken man. The most famous battle in European history in the 19th century, seen not through the point of view of strategy of the generals, not through some careful analysis of what happened militarily, but rather through the eyes of a drunken man. And yet, this drunken man exhibited, perhaps unconsciously, a kind of courage that was far beyond that of what was officially touted as courage. As far as Tolstoy was concerned, the official notions of courage, the official rewarding of courage, were all wrong. Genuine courage was that of the common soldier who, through thick and thin, through the suffering of the battlefield, through insufficient supplies, sometimes through hunger and thirst and many other ways, nevertheless held his ground. And this was very often the kind of people, directly the kind of people who were ignored totally by the government. There's a very famous statement by Tolstoy near the end of this story that tells a lot about his art and what's going to become of the art. He says something like this: "The hero of my tale, whom I love with all my soul's powers, whom I've tried to evoke in all his beauty, who always was, who always is and always will be, is not some hero or villain, is the truth. There's only one thing that I glorify in my tales, and that is the truth. And there's no such thing as a human being who is either entirely heroic or entirely evil, entirely good or entirely bad. All human beings are tremendous mixtures of various moral qualities, and I will catch these various moral qualities and put them together in people whom you really believe. And that is the hero of my tale. That is the truth. That is the one I will always be faithful to." Of course, there could not be a better place to begin the consideration of the famous novel War and Peace than this particular statement. Because, of course, in War and Peace, you get the picture of people who are tremendously mixed. You get a statement of the question, what do we mean by war? What do we mean by peace? Now remember that Tolstoy had seen war down in the Crimea. He had seen war at its most terrible point, and of course a point that led to a terrible and seemingly disgraceful Russian defeat. This is what was the meaning, the genuine meaning of war. As far as peace was concerned, where could you understand peace? Well, of course, you understood peace in family life. You understood peace in the relationships of brothers and sisters, of cousins and uncles and aunts, of that everyday life that we all know, that of course many critics consider to be banal. My goodness, who doesn't know relations between fathers and sons? Who doesn't know the relations between brothers and sisters? Who doesn't know family life? Tolstoy, they said, is the artist of the banal. And as a matter of fact, there's a great deal of truth in that. Tolstoy sees the banal. Tolstoy sees the relationships of family life, but he says the banal is not just banality. The banal is the essence of life. And as a matter of fact, this is shown not only in peace, but also in war. These human qualities that we see in family life carry themselves out in the relationship between soldiers, the relationship on the battlefield, the relationship of politics. Everything in the world, in a certain sense, can be reduced to family life. So that you don't just examine war on the field of battle. You don't just examine politics in the words of statesmen. You don't just examine military strategy in the words of generals. No, you get down to the life of the individual, the life which is totally unpredictable. You get together thousands and thousands of people the way you do in an army. It's impossible to predict what they're going to do because the fate of every human being is individual and is connected with that human being. You must examine the individual human being, and in examining the individual human being, you're examining one of those thousands and millions of fates that makes up the entire fate of the entire world. That's what War and Peace is genuinely about. And of course, the young Tolstoy was beginning to examine this in ways that would lead to the kind of literature that he was doing. So in a certain sense, the presentation of Sevastopol, as he called it, his description of the Crimean War called Tales Around Sevastopol, these descriptions are in many ways the workbook. Just as Diary of a Writer was the workbook for Dostoevsky and how he constructed the Brothers Karamazov, so this book, this early piece of his, Tales of Sevastopol, is the workbook on how he would develop his grand and enormous novels, which seem to encompass an entire universe, where no two individuals are exactly the same. As a matter of fact, not only are no two individuals exactly the same, no two animals are exactly the same. No two horses have the same character in his works. This is what we get out of the early works of Tolstoy. This is what's going to develop in his establishment of family life, the very famous family of Tolstoy that produced, his wife gave birth to 13 children, 7 of whom grew to maturity. This is what Tolstoy is going to present in those great novels, which we'll examine in the following lectures.